Hello again, class. It's Professor A again, and today we're going to be talking about romantic orientations and romantic love and the difference between libido and sexual orientation. Quick review of what we discussed so far. In the first lecture, we talked about asexuality, stuff you should have known from 101, and then we talked about the sexual and romantic orientation grid. In the second lecture, we talked about the A spectrum and a bit about demi and asexuality. So taking that knowledge, we are going to build on top of that and talk about romantic orientations. So we're going to start with that. So remember back in the first lecture when I talked about the sexual orientation grid? Well, I only wrote the prefixes because with that grid you can also have romantic orientations as well. So I'm going to draw that out real quick. Right, it looks something like this, where you have pan and A on opposite ends and hetero and homo on the opposite ends as well, and it makes that house structure. Well, the first lecture we talked about was just the sexual orientation side of it. Now we can talk about the romantic orientation. It's the exact same thing. It's just instead of writing homosexual or pansexual, it would be rather heteroromantic or aromantic. So let's talk a little bit about those orientations now. So here I wrote up what each orientation in the simplest of terms really means. So first, we already know sexual orientation. That means who you want to do the deed with, who you would like to have sex with. Romantic orientation is a little bit different. That's more of who you actually love and who you want to be with. That's more of the romantic and more of the dating or courtship side of a relationship rather than the sexual side. That's the main difference between romantic and sexual in terms of orientation. Some examples of romantic love could be going out on a date with a person or going out for a walk, spending more close, more intimate time together. Meanwhile, sexual orientation or sexual love is just really more of who you want to do it with. Again, it's pretty simple, but they're very important distinctions. Here I wrote 3 different types of orientations that people may feel. Here we have ace-aro, ace-biro, and pansexual aromantic. So let's go through one by one, just as examples. So ace-aro, that is asexual aromantic. That means you feel no attraction, no sexual or romantic attraction towards anybody of any gender. Now ace-biro, that means you don't feel sexual attraction towards anybody, but you do feel romantic attraction towards 2 or more genders. Then you have pansexual aromantic. That means you feel sexual attraction to all genders, but you don't feel any romantic attraction, hence aro. Then for good measure, I also wrote up homo-homo. Homosexual, homoromantic. That means someone who feels sexual attraction and romantic attraction for people of their gender. So why did I write these 4 things up here on the board? Well, quite simple. They indicate one major point, is that sometimes, in the case of 1 and 4 right here, your sexual attraction and your romantic attraction match. In the case of the number 4 right here, they match. Say a gay man is only sexually attracted and only really likes to date other gay men. Or an ace-aro person has no attraction, sexual or romantic, towards anybody of any gender. These 2 match. But 2 and 3 right here, they don't match. Say the ace-biro, and you have the antithesis, pansexual aromantic. These 2 do not match, and that is actually very common in the asexual community. As I stated in the last lecture, this is very personal to whoever is feeling this attraction. For me, the reason I wrote ace-biro is also that's because I am asexual biromantic, as you can no doubt tell by the profile picture I selected. So we talked a bit about romantic love, how that works, and types of romantic attraction, how they may or may not match. So let's move on to our last point, that asexuality is not the same as libido. These are 2 very different things, and I will define them right now. When we say libido, we're talking mainly about the sex drive. And a lot of that has to do with hormones in the body. When we're talking about asexuality, that's more of how you feel and attract towards other people. So I want to give you a quick biology lesson, a little anatomy lesson on how a lot of libido works, especially when it comes to the hormonal releases. So this quick illustration I drew shows how a lot of libido is formed using hormones. So you have your anterior pituitary gland right here, which is in your brain. And that releases a hormone called ACTH. And then it goes through this right here is a bloodstream. And it goes to this structure right here, which is the kidney. And right that sits above the kidney is called the adrenal gland. And more specifically, ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex, which releases hormones class called androgens. Now this includes testosterone, estrogen, DHEA, and androstenedione. Androstenedione is converted into testosterone in both men and women. However, DHEA is converted to testosterone in men, but is estrogen in women. Men have another structure called the testicles that also produce testosterone. So men really don't need androstenedione to function normally. However, women completely depend on this hormone because this is the only way they can get testosterone, because their ovaries produce estrogen. DHEA is produced in the estrogen. The only way to get testosterone is via androstenedione. Testosterone is a very important hormone in the body. Another thing that happens in phys is we talk about what happens when too much or too little of this is secreted. Now let's focus mainly on androstenedione because DHEA is not really prevalent to our story. When too much androstenedione is released, it makes a lot of testosterone, and that will cause a hormone imbalance. Now in men, this really doesn't have much of an effect because our testicles make so much testosterone to begin with. A lot of the effects of hyper and hyposecretion of this are more or less masked. Now when it comes to hypersecretion of it, it releases way more of this, which increases more masculine traits, and it also has an adverse effect of increasing one's libido. I want to make a quick footnote here because I left something important out. So in men, I did say that hyper and hyposecretion are more or less masked in men. That is mostly true. However, there can be more hypersecretion in men since men have way more testosterone. If it's really going off, then you'll start noticing those more hypersecretion traits. However, this is not very common, and if you ever see more of those high testosterone levels, it's more often than not, it's usually a problem with the testicles and not usually with the adrenal gland, and it comes specifically to men. Now, this effect is not really seen in men because there's just so much testosterone to begin with. It's kind of like adding a bucket of water to an ocean. You're not really going to see any difference. But in women, there is a massive difference. That's like adding a bucket of water to a kiddie pool. You're going to see it actually increase a bit. Now, when we get to hyposecretion, again, in men, it doesn't really show up anywhere because, say we lose this entire ability in men, we would never know because our testicles make enough testosterone to begin with. But in women, they would feel it because this is the only way they can get testosterone. And one of the side effects is a decrease in libido. So that's a little bit of the hormones of how libido works. Now there's plenty of others that also play into this, but this is one of the main ones that causes this. So why did I go through all the science and all the jargon about libido? Well, it was to illustrate the point that libido was hormonal and has nothing to do with your attraction towards other people. And it's a bit of cool science that I thought I would teach y'all. These two have nothing to do with each other. I've met a few asexuals that had absolutely no sex drive, and I've met a few that have a really high sex drive. People just have different hormone levels in their bodies. Some people have a high hormone. Some people just enjoy having sex. It is pleasurable for them. Some people, not so much. Again, it's really personal for the person in each circumstance. Some people really like it and have a high libido, some people don't want it at all. And there is one other trait about asexuality that is also worth mentioning. People that are sex positive, sex negative, or sex neutral. Sex positive in this case are people that don't mind having sex. Some asexuals like to do that. They would be considered sex positive. Then there's people who are the antithesis, that are sex negative or sex repulsed. They think the act is gross and they don't want to do it, or it's not pleasurable. And then there's people in the middle that are just neutral to it. They're like, I could take it or leave it. So that'll be all for today's lecture class. So a quick overview of what we talked about today. First, we talked about romantic orientations and romantic love and how that works. And then we discussed how asexuality and libido, while oftentimes can be confusing, really isn't that confusing, and also the main difference between the two. That's all I have for today. Have a good day, class.